Hi, I'm Seraphalor, and welcome to yet another video. Honkai Star Rails 3.0 is right around the corner. We'll be introduced to the land of Amateurish, and meet new characters, learn new lore, and much, much more. However, I am not really excited about 3.0. Don't get me wrong, I am looking forward to it, but part of me dreads having to go through the 3.x story. This is all because of how poorly Honkai Star Rail's story is told. Let's get into it. Now, I really do love the story, characters, and lore of the game, but I will not pretend like the story is told in a way that's engaging for people. I was going to give an example of a story cutscene in Penacony, and then shorten the cutscene through editing. But to my surprise, I was reminded that these cutscenes last 8 to 10 minutes at a time. I don't want my video to be that long, so I'll get into the crux of the problem I have with Honkai Star Rail's storytelling. The storytelling is very bad. Cutscenes are badly paced, it's low production value, characters are too verbose, and the story gets bogged down by its own jargon and terminology. These things keep the storytelling of Honkai Star Rail from not only being easy to digest, but it makes the story look worse than what it actually is. For example, while I think Penacony is fantastic, I know many people loathe the story because of how poorly Penacony was told. It asks too much of the player. It wants the player to sift through hours of verbose dialogue and reread and reinterpret character interactions and jargon, when it shouldn't be like this. The storytelling should make Penacony enjoyable enough for the average player, but have some deep themes and lore for people who actively look for it. This is where I think the writers of HSR are misguided. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's break down my issues with the storytelling of HSR and how they can be fixed. Let's start with the cutscenes and how badly they are paced. A majority of the cutscenes in the story involve characters standing around and using stock animations, such as hand movements, head turning, a pose here and there, and occasionally they walk. In a vacuum, I don't have a problem with these types of cutscenes. One of my favorite games, Final Fantasy XIV, uses this style of cutscene very often to help their storytelling. Typically in FF14, these cutscenes aren't voiced, however, in Honkai Star Rail, they usually are voice acted. However, what separates FF14 and HSR's cutscenes is the poor pacing of HSR's cutscenes. Cutscenes go on for far too long, holding only a little bit of information. For example, the cutscene with Acheron and the Dream Master in 2.2. Did we really need 8 minutes to explain that the Dream Master was kicking Acheron out of Penacony out of fear of the Nihility? Or could that have been a cutscene condensed to 2 or 3 minutes? Did we need to have the Charmony Dub backstory fed to us multiple times? Or could that have been shown to us once and referenced here and there without repeating the story ad nauseum? There are other examples too of cutscenes having poor pacing. The initial Aventurine flashback before we take control of him in 2.1, Boot Hill's introduction in 2.2, Acheron and Welt's conversation in 2.1, and the list goes on. It feels like the writers really liked what they had written and went too hard on making the story feel fleshed out. But in reality, it had the opposite effect on most watchers by making the story feel bloated and a slog. Now, on to the production value. HSR cinematic cutscenes are very cool and awesome to look at, but they are few and far between. It feels like they aren't done enough, and the developers are more than happy with giving us a still image. Going back to the poor pacing of cutscenes, it feels like the still images and cutscenes are used to, poorly, mask the pacing of the cutscenes by hiding the bog standard animations. But in doing so, it makes the cutscenes feel even poorer by comparison. Once again, going back to Final Fantasy XIV, the game had this problem as well, where the production value just wasn't there. during the relaunch with The Realm Reborn, and at that time, it was understandable. FF14 1.0 was a massive failure, and Yoshi P and team were given 2 years to make 2.0, and had to cut massive corners to ship a minimal, viable product, and cutscenes suffered as a result. Of course, when the money started coming in, we got more motion capture cutscenes and cinematics, elevating the storytelling of FF14 to the legendary status it has today. Honkai Star Rail doesn't get that luxury. It's the second major AAA game released by Hoyoverse after the groundbreaking success of Genshin Impact, so it shouldn't be suffering for such amateurish and cheap-feeling production value. Sure, HSR is a mobile title too, but there are plenty of mobile games nowadays with high-quality cutscenes and direction, especially from Hoyoverse's own catalog like Honkai Impact 3rd. Finally, let's talk about character verbosity and the technical jargon bogging the story down. These two things go hand in hand with making casual story readers feel lost and confused. Now, me personally, I don't mind it if a character is verbose or the story gets deep in its technical jargon, as long as there is some counterbalance. A non-verbose character translating for the audience, like Alize sometimes does for Urianger in Final Fantasy XIV, but it becomes a problem when the majority of characters act like this. In Penacony alone, we have Acheron, Black Swan, Aventurine, Dr. Ratio, Sunday, Robin, Firefly, Welt, Himiko, Gallagher, and probably more characters I haven't mentioned, all speaking verbosely with technical jargon players need to be constantly reminded of. I know what the Omen Vanguards and history fictionologists are. I read the databanks, but I can't, nor the developers, should expect the average reader to immediately understand without being reminded or told what these terms mean. I thought that was the role of March 7th during the Penacony story, but she really didn't do a lot of that. So the storytelling of Honkai Star Rail isn't where it needs to be. Cutscenes are too long and slow-paced, the characters are too verbose, and the production value doesn't match the game's absurd revenue. And there's too much technical jargon conflating and bloating the narrative. So what can be done to fix these issues? It's simple, really, and it starts with the cutscene pacing. If the cutscenes are paced better, almost everything else will fall into place. Shorter cutscenes means the onus is on the writers and developers to deliver information in a clear and concise way. Forcing them to write characters that aren't nearly as verbose and forces them to briefly explain any technical jargon brought up, either through the use of characters like March 7th or the Trailblazer through non-meme dialogue options to ask what the character is talking about. Also, shorter, concise cutscenes allow us to get to the good parts faster. The battles and the cinematics. This fixes the issue of casual players getting lost in the sauce of the storytelling, allowing them to enjoy the story without feeling overwhelmed, and it makes the deep lore of HSR more accessible, without intimidating the player with terms they may have forgotten or never heard of until it's brought up in the story for the first time. I doubt 3.0's story will be told better than Penacony. This type of feedback is only reaching the developers post-mortem, if it is at all, so I'm not going to hold my breath. But I am going to brace myself and take my time sifting through 3.0's story, and I recommend you should too. Thanks for watching. I'm on my way to 200 subscribers, so if you like my content, consider subscribing. See ya.
You to move fast. We don't know what's happening in the dreamscape or how much of what the memo keeper said is true. And that Acheron, who knows what she intends to do.